Welcome to The Explainer. So, today we're looking at something absolutely foundational. We spend so much time figuring out the daily mechanics of our lives, like managing our schedules or getting through the workday, but we rarely step back and look at the actual architectural plans, the historical philosophies that literally serve as blueprints for modern living. Today, we're diving into virtue ethics. And hey, this isn't just some dry, abstract theory. These are highly practical, wildly different frameworks built by some of history's absolute greatest minds to answer one massive, overarching question: how do we actually live a good life? Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our structural roadmap of the vastly different historical thinkers we'll explore today. We're going to start with the Stoic mindset, move through faith and free will, explore Epicurean pleasure, examine the shift toward individual reason, and finally, evaluate the entire overarching framework. Section 1. The Stoic mindset, mental peace and reason. Preparing to demystify a term we hear all the time. A Stoic is a person who remains unmoved by the sorrows and afflictions that distress the rest of humanity. Now, that's a term we hear thrown around constantly today, especially when dealing with stress, right? But in its original philosophical form, it's exactly what that definition says. In our modern world, which is just saturated with anxiety and endless stressors, you can immediately see why this ancient concept is so incredibly appealing. It's the ultimate pursuit of mental peace. But listen, the Stoics didn't just ignore their problems. They had a really specific method for dealing with them, which brings us to their core operating system. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it divides our entire reality into two distinct columns. The Stoics believed that you've got to live harmoniously with nature, fully acknowledging that you are just a small part of a much larger organic whole. That means there's a whole bunch of external things, that column on the right, that are completely out of your control. And if we try to control those external things, well, we're bound to get incredibly frustrated. But look at the left side. The Stoics taught that control over our internal emotions and judgments is literally the only path to happiness. We might feel physical pain, sure, but a wise person knows that pain leaves the true, reasoning self totally untouched. And that brings us to the legacy of reason. The Stoics made this absolutely bold departure from the thinkers who came before them. Aristotle, for instance, said that only a select few people can truly reason. But the Stoics? No way. They believed all human beings share the capacity to reason. This is huge, because if everyone can reason, then everyone can pursue virtue. This pointed them directly to the idea of a universal moral law, effectively rejecting ethical relativism altogether. For a Stoic, money and fame might be fine, but they're fleeting. The only thing that is profoundly good is an excellent rational mental state, achieved through that universal capacity for reason. Section 2. Faith, War, and Free Will. Theology and virtue. As history progressed, virtue ethics crashed right into major theological movements. Looking at these impartially as historical blueprints, our first stop is St. Augustine and his wildly influential idea of free will. Augustine argued that human beings were created as rational beings who can clearly distinguish between good and bad. Because of this, humans possess complete freedom to choose and perform actions. The consequence of this theory? It's massive. It takes the heavy burden of ethical responsibility and places it directly on our own shoulders. Simply put, if a person does something wrong, the responsibility lies entirely with them. Later on, we see another massive structural shift with Thomas Aquinas. Now, Aquinas was a major supporter of Plato and Aristotle, but he essentially gave their ethical systems a huge upgrade. He took Plato's 4 cardinal virtues, prudence, temperance, courage, and justice, and he stacked 3 theological virtues right on top of them: faith, hope, and charity. By seamlessly blending ancient Greek philosophy with theology, he created this comprehensive 7-part ethical system that essentially became the standard for Christianity. And this brilliantly illustrates how structured virtue ethics can be applied to real-world crises, because Aquinas didn't stop at personal virtues. He applied his logic to the ultimate, most devastating moral dilemma of all: warfare. Aquinas laid out his just war theory in clear, practical steps. First, war absolutely must be the last resort, period. Second, it must be a defense against aggression or an active attempt to stop an atrocity. And third, the expected good must mathematically outweigh the terrible cost of killing and destruction. It's a fascinating application of structured reasoning to absolute societal chaos. Section 3. Epicurean pleasure and tranquility. Pursuit of tranquility. Let's look at a completely different approach to the good life. Now, let's pivot sharply away from duty and theology and explore something else entirely: pleasure. Surprisingly, when you hear the word Epicurean, you probably think of wild indulgence, the whole shebang. But notice the distinction on the screen. They completely separated coarse bodily pleasures, which they saw as inferior and temporary, from the refined pleasures of the mind. To an Epicurean, the absolute highest obtainable pleasure is actually tranquility. And how do you get tranquility? Well, not by getting everything you want, but by eliminating unsatisfied wants. By radically simplifying your desires, even someone who isn't wealthy can easily satisfy them and achieve a superior, durable state of peace. But this raises a very serious problem, doesn't it? If the absolute only thing that matters is your own personal pleasure, and determining if something is good just means asking, did it increase my pleasure or reduce my pain, then what stops someone from doing terrible things in secret? Seriously, why not commit injustice when we can get away with it? Epicurus actually anticipated this exact loophole, and his answer perfectly resolves the problem while staying totally true to his framework. He argued that you shouldn't commit injustice because the perpetual dread of discovery will cause painful anxiety. For an Epicurean, getting caught isn't necessarily the problem. It's the constant, agonizing mental fear of getting caught that completely ruins the very tranquility you're trying to build in the first place. Section 4. Reason and the individual. Logic and individuality. As we push closer to the modern era, later thinkers began stripping away the theology. This brings us to René Descartes, and perhaps the most famous philosophical quote of all time, "I think, therefore I am." Descartes completely cemented the idea that human reason is the ultimate tool. For him, correct reasoning alone is completely sufficient in our search for the good things we should seek. Virtue isn't about following a bunch of outside rules. Virtue consists of the correct reasoning that should, all by itself, guide our actions. Building on that intense focus on the individual, we eventually reach Jean-Paul Sartre. Now, Sartre flips the script on how we usually think about societal rules. He argued that individuals must be concerned with ethics rather than looking to society to figure it out, simply because it is the individuals who ultimately impact and create that society. It's a heavy concept. It means salvation, or ethical success, must come completely from within, giving humanity a deep sense of dignity and the potential for infinite progress. Section 5, Evaluating Virtue Ethics. Advantages and limitations. Let's move to and see how this builds into our final evaluation. We've seen a huge variety of these blueprints today, but how well does this overarching framework actually hold up? Well, there are massive advantages to virtue ethics. First off, it offers a much broader conception of ethics in general. Rather than just blindly grading your actions against a rigid, inflexible set of rules, it cares deeply about who you are as a person internally. It pays intense attention to your inner states and feelings, because it doesn't just focus exclusively on abstract actions. It has successfully opened doors to completely novel approaches, including feminist insights that boldly argue traditional philosophy ignores the reality of concrete interpersonal relationships. Simply put, virtue ethics cares about the whole human. So the crucial point is, where does it fail? The limitations are actually pretty severe. Critics argue that asking, "How can I flourish?" is really just a fancy way of asking what will make you happy. It kind of turns ethics into self-interest, rather than focusing on how we treat other people. Furthermore, it gives basically zero guidance on specific dilemmas. If you have to decide whether to lie to save a friend from embarrassment, virtue ethics just says, do what a virtuous person would do, which is frankly totally unhelpful. But perhaps the biggest flaw is that it largely grades people on luck. Think about it. People have natural temperaments. Maybe you're naturally brave, timid, or passionate, which are super hard to alter. Combine that with the completely random circumstances of how you're raised, and virtue ethics often ends up bestowing praise and blame on people simply for being fortunate. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought to ponder. If so much of our character is dictated by our innate temperament and the completely random circumstances of our upbringing, does having virtue truly make you a good person, or does it just make you a lucky one? It's a question that challenges the very foundation of how we judge ourselves and others, and I really hope it leaves you eager to keep exploring these incredible philosophical blueprints. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer,